So the historical background, I'll start with vaginal steaming because that's a little bit more obscure. Is basically what we've found is that cultures around the world have been steaming since the beginning of time. We've discovered indigenous and modern cultures in over 50 different places in the world documenting and using vaginal steaming. And that's kind of amazing to me. And more, it's just like the more we talk about it, the more we find out and the more we understand. So the more people are starting to come out of the woodworks, the more we realize what all this really simple, beautiful practice can address. But one thing that's pretty much across the board in every place is postpartum care. So what's really miraculous and what caught my attention at first was the incredible relief and expedition of healing that women experience postpartum. So there haven't been that many peer-reviewed scientific studies on vaginal steaming in the United States. There have been a few in Europe. There's been one in the United States so far, and it was on postpartum. And they basically discovered that across 5 or 6, maybe even up to 8 different symptoms that they were watching, like fundal height returning to normal, scar tissue remediation, lochia, weight gain or loss after birth, hormone regulation, and mood and postpartum depression, just to name a few. They found in the 2 groups, they had a group of women that steamed and a group of women that didn't steam, and the group of women who steamed were recovered in 8 days to the point where the other group took 6 weeks to get to. Like, amazing. They were blown away by the results of this study, and although it was really a small group and they're urging more studies to be done, this was 2 of my teachers that funded it themselves and had it done with a midwife at UC Davis. So it's not complete in any way, but it just makes me very curious and excited about what else we can discover if we study this a little bit more. So that piece in particular for doulas and for mothers and sisters and aunties in general is just such a beautiful and approachable postpartum care practice that covers all the bases. So vaginal steaming is really a simple practice. It's a steaming pot of herbs that you sit over, basically. And then when you sit, you're exposing this highly mucosal tissue. The pelvis in general is highly mucosal, but particularly the exterior tissues. And cell walls are easily penetrated by steam, which carries these plant essences down in that pelvic region. So the benefits of this herbally medicated steam don't only treat the exterior of the vagina, which is really super beneficial for women if they've had any tears or any scar tissue ever, but most importantly with a recent birth. But it translates inside of the pelvis through all the tissues into the soft tissue and the connective tissue that holds the structures, the uterus and the bladder in place. So it's preventing prolapses and it's helping heal prolapses, and it's melting scar tissue, literally melting it, and also melting out endometriosis, melting fibroids and cysts out of the body in a matter of a short period of time, depending on how big the cyst or the fibroid is. Within a few months even, women are seeing like something that would require surgery previously. So that's really exciting training. So the Mayan abdominal massage practice was brought to the United States by a woman named Rosita Arvigo, and it's often called the Arvigo Mayan abdominal massage technique, but she learned it in Guatemala from indigenous Mayan healers. And it started as a postpartum practice that is Oh, it's very widely applicable now, but I learned about vaginal steaming, and so did my teacher, and from my abdominal practitioners. So there's a very strong Central American representation. And then currently in the United States, before, I don't want to sound rude, but before us white people found out about this, the Korean culture was very active with abdominal and pelvic steaming, and they have spas. I don't know where they all are. There are definitely a lot in California, and there's one in Chicago that I've been to. So when Kelly Garza, my teacher, started steaming after her pregnancy, she started finding so many things relieved. So she started building steam boxes, and she built one for herself and then built one for a friend and told her friend about it. And then her business went crazy. All of a sudden, everybody's knocking down her door to get a steam box. And in a minute, I'll show you the one I built. So it started as this funny little like living room entrepreneurial thing. And then she got really excited about the statistics and understanding where else this is happening in the world. And she started doing the research, and now she's training practitioners and facilitators, and she runs the Peri-Steam Hydrotherapy Institute, which has some pretty amazing high-level training available for birth workers, for gynecologists, for women's health practitioners in all realms, doulas, midwives. So there's a lot of people now who have kind of all gone into this to this training and learned, and now have been doing a bunch of treatment for their patients and collecting data. So what we have is this incredible resource of practitioners who have been keeping good records and doing client studies. So even though a lot of what we claim to that vaginal steaming can do cannot be backed up by peer-reviewed studies yet, there's a bunch of case studies, like a bunch. And I'm part of an active group of people who are just really interested in helping other women and resourcing. And you know, this was the way midwifery was before gynecology showed up. You know, women took care of each other. Yeah. So there's kind of a very beautiful back to grassroots, back to the female practitioner movement behind this very simple solve all practice, which is why I love it. It's helping women save so much money and pain in the long term and in the short term. So that's the sort of 1-2 on vaginal steaming itself. A lot of this is understood by looking back retrospectively and kind of putting the pieces together, like why did that work? What herbs are working for what? There are four different herb blends that I use. One is specific for women who are experiencing like uterine fatigue. So their cycles typically are shorter than 27 days. And they may be experiencing like skipping cycles, and their uterus may not be responding that well, maybe because of fertility, leftover fertility issues from being on hormonal birth control. So there's a gentle blend that's extra nourishing, and then there's a cleansing blend to help the uterus actually holds on to material. I was so blown away to know this, and now that I understand how vaginal steaming works, it makes total sense. Even if you've never had a baby, there's material that gets stuck up in your uterus that your body, if your uterus is tilted over to the side, or if your uterus is just a little bit fatigued, if you've been under high stress, it doesn't have the strength to express all the material, then it ends up getting like left over in there, and that can cause painful periods, first of all, because the uterus is having to contract pretty vigorously to expel. And depending on what's going on, sometimes there's It's the angle or the tilt of the uterus that prevents that material from coming out. Sometimes the uterus itself is, like I said, fatigued and weak. And sometimes when we insert tampons, they almost prevent the uterus from expelling properly. So there's a big piece of the period pain part that I think is very interesting. So the way that vaginal steaming helps with that, and the way I like to use vaginal steaming and abdominal massage together, because there's sort of like a 1-2 punch. So when there's material in the uterus that is having trouble getting out, or experiencing painful periods, vaginal steaming helps by coming in and bringing a lot of nutrient rich steam, as well as nourishing and tonifying the tissues. So when you experience it, you kind of understand what I mean. It feels like a lot of tension is sort of melted out, like the muscles become highly stimulated. There's a lot of circulation that comes into the area. The lymph system gets stimulated, and the tissues sort of wake up. So if there was like an imprint of or some leftover contraction or tension in like the left side of your pelvis for whatever reason, maybe you fell on your tailbone when you were a kid, or maybe you have endometriosis on that side more so than the right, or whatever it is. Sometimes one side contracts more than the other and it has trouble releasing. Well, the steam does a really good job of just kind of massaging. And then an abdominal massage itself comes with like some more manual manipulation to help release the tension in the musculature and in the soft tissue. And then what happens is the uterus can right itself naturally. It's just like it's a normal thing that happens for it to come back to center when the tension's released. But when it's pulling on one side, it gets yanked over, or it gets knocked over, and it just kind of doesn't come back without a equal and opposite force until you learn how to manually manipulate it or release all of the tension and allow your body to rejuvenate and bring itself back to center on its own. So that's one big reason why pelvic pain exists. And period pain exists is because of there being material still stuck in the pelvis. But beyond the physiological piece of the conversation and this, like, why is this residual tension here? There's a lot to be said about lifestyle and the way we get habituated to stress and end up in just like a frozen experience. Whenever we get frightened or scared or tense or stressed, and anytime you feel your jaw respond, some people, it's easier to really like pay attention to your jaw because it's here in your head. Your pelvis is it's sort of mirroring that tension, and it's a lot more difficult to notice when you're tensing up in your pelvis. We've just been, over the course of our lifetimes, because of a range of things, awkward touch, gynecological exams that were just yucky, to like the other end of the spectrum of being like abused or trespassed, we've learned to disassociate a little or a lot. So when we don't really know what's going on inside of our pelvis muscularly, or how we're responding to the lifestyle choices we're making, or things that are happening to us in our lives, it's really easy for tension to build up. So there's this kind of psycho-spiritual piece of the conversation too, that when you take time to slow down with an intention to treat yourself well, to nourish your pelvis, to nourish your uterus, and you sit on this steam box with that intention, there's an unwinding that happens, and that is almost more powerful for women. Just like I've heard so many of my clients say, I've really never like done anything nice like this for myself. It's sad that we don't have practices like that. And that's why I think I'm so excited to talk about this, because I think vaginal steaming is just such a beautiful everyday self wellness practice. Yes, it is actually really amazing for when we are so out of touch, we've gotten into pathology, like things have gotten dysfunctional, but we can do a lot with preventative care just by taking good care of our pelvises. And I think that excites me. So that pelvic pain, period pain thing could also have to do with growths, tissue that doesn't belong growing. It could be endometriosis that's causing period pain. It could be cysts on the cervix or abnormal tissue anywhere. It could be fibroids. There could be a lot of reasons why people experience painful periods and or painful, I'll say painful sex as well, because a lot of the same conditions cause both. And when we have painful periods and painful sex, then it's like a really, really hard to occupy on a daily basis, to just be here in our bodies and feel feminine and feel grateful for having a uterus. So without even needing to know why the pain is there, vaginal steaming is really beautiful and helps a lot and really fast. So I'll use my story. I used to have debilitating period pain, and I was told by gynecologists that I had a tilted uterus, like in passing, like, oh, no big deal, your uterus is tilted to the right. And the first time I heard it, I was like, what? And they're like, oh yeah, no, don't worry about it, that's normal. But it's not normal. It's common, but it's not normal. And it's also not normal to have painful cramps during your menstrual cycle. That's not a sign of a normal healthy cycle. And believe it or not, there is such a thing as a normal healthy cycle. And the only reason I can say that with absolute confidence is because I have found one, and it's matched what I have discovered for my clients after they have relieved themselves of all of their symptoms. Everybody winds up with a cycle that looks the same. And we're like, with all the case studies of all the other practitioners, we're seeing the same thing. So it's a 4 to 5 day bleed. It's 28 days long. It's bright red. There's no brown, pink mucus before or after. There's no cramping. There's no mood swings. There's no irritability. There's no weird cravings. There's no weight gain. There's no bloating. There's no breast soreness. All of that stuff goes away. All of that is actually just like your body telling you that there's something up. And oftentimes it's like there's material inside of your pelvis and inside of your uterus that shouldn't be there, or there's a bunch of tension, and you probably need to like look at your lifestyle a little bit. So having a conversation about the specifics, like what causes endometriosis specifically? Why are those uterine lining cells outside of the body? I don't fucking care. What we need to know is like, why, what are we trying to like get out of? What are we holding? You know, like there's a lot of ways in which we relate to the world around us as an outside of us, when it's actually like we're imploding all of that. So that's the like number one takeaway that I would like people to really understand about pelvic health in general is there's nothing wrong with what's going on, what the symptoms are inside of your body, inside of your pelvis, in your sex drive, in the way your period is showing up. It's just information. And what I love about vaginal steaming so much is it's this amazing tool for you to tune in, listen, and recalibrate with your body's innate wisdom. It just shows up. You don't have to have, I mean, okay, yeah, there are 4 different herb blends, but I think honestly, we could use any herbs, and how much of that is a placebo effect and how much of that is actually working. At this point, I don't even care, but the intention that we have to sit down and welcome the steam in and to relax, learn to relax our pussies and our bellies. Holy shit, like that alone is incredibly therapeutic. But I don't know, I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to let go until I experienced the physical letting go. You can't do letting go, you know? So my pelvis was all out of whack. My background, I've spent a bunch of time as a yoga teacher, specifically working with pelvic floor health, and then studying to be a doula, both birth and postpartum, and been doing body work and abdominal massage for 15 years. And then I started understanding more and learning about vaginal steaming about 2 years ago. So like all of these things kind of brought me along this personal journey of like healing my own pelvic problems. I thought I was really messed up because before I started this journey 15 years ago, I realized I had pelvic dysfunction. I had been like hiding and burying this trespass that had happened to me when I was a kid. And I was having like all these weird outbreaks in yoga class and during sex, and like all this like stuff coming out of the cracks. It's like dams were. So I got really curious, and my periods were horrible. In fact, I remember being 16 and having a doctor prescribe birth control, not because I was sexually active, but because of the period pain. And that's a whole nother conversation, honestly, because all that does is shut down our reproductive system. And we're not cycle. I mean, you guys know this. This is just like, it's barbaric to turn our reproductive systems off. It's really depleting our hormones in a way that we suffer for later in life. So I'm pretty against hormonal birth control for most applications, but that helped me for a little while until I started getting educated on that and got off of it. And then I had to deal with the pelvic pain, and I didn't know where to turn. And so when I finally found out that there were ways that I could do pelvic floor release on my own, which I was doing manually with my own hands, I learned and trained in that, and that was really valuable. And the Mayan abdominal massage helped me get my pelvis in order, but I still had tension and I still was experiencing incontinence. There's two kinds of incontinence. There's stress incontinence, and then there's urge incontinence, and they are telling you different things about the levels of tone in your pelvis. So if you're leaking when you're sneezing, that's stress incontinence, and that's usually because of a lack of tone in the pelvic floor or the pelvis. But if it's happening that you are like feeling this crazy urge hit you like a freight train, then all of a sudden you have to pee or you're going to pee your pants, that's urge incontinence, and that's a sign of too much tone in the pelvis. So as a yoga practitioner, I was doing all this pelvic floor exercises and making myself too gripped, and I didn't know how to let go. And I was having all this trouble, the same kind of trouble that like a brand new mama would have, just a little different. So strange. So one of the first things that sold me on this practice was within 1 month of vaginal steaming, I totally sorted out all of that pelvic pain and all of the issues I was having with my cycle, which was like debilitating pain that would send me to bed for the whole day. Gone. I would have weird cramps and, weird clots and just like very irregular bleeding and brown blood and crazy moods, and all that's gone. I don't have trouble with menstruation anymore. And I mean, if you've never, some women never have, but I think many women, it really disrupts their lifestyle on a monthly basis. There's the dread of it coming, and then the suffering of it, and then the recuperation after. And now my cycle is this time I look forward to slow down and to really like tune in and listen and pay attention to what my body's telling me. I learned so much by observing my menstrual cycle about how well I took care of myself the month before. So that's been revolutionary. So that kind of leads me in a little bit to this fertility conversation. So when you're cycling, regularly like that, and you're understanding what's going on, and you're in touch with your ovulation, I can feel my body ovulate now. I have so much sensitivity. I can feel my cervix. None of that was possible for me before I started doing this kind of exploration. And for most women, there's just not a conversation being had in the fertility community. And I worked specifically on fertility for an entire year. I had a big care for women struggling with infertility, because as a doula, I would just, I would see women going through some really tough shit in their births. And I just kept thinking to myself, man, I really wish I had been able to see them sooner. and maybe we could have done something about all of this tension and all of this contraction and these unmet stories. Because when a woman's going through birth, everything just blows open. It's just a complete explosion on every level of opening. And so I started asking to see my clients sooner. And then eventually I was really fascinated with what was happening in that preconception phase. Like how could we set a woman up to have a really miraculous experience through pregnancy and birth? And that led me to having a conversation about fertility itself and understanding deeply that it is the infertility. I love to use air quotes around that because I think it's a fake news. I don't think it's true. It doesn't mean there's a dysfunction with a woman if she has infertility. It's so fucked up to label that on someone and tell them they've got a problem with this very basic human function. It's like, what are we here to do besides procreate? Oh, you're dysfunctional in that very basic, like, how fucked up is it that women have to overcome that hurdle? And then how are they supposed to look at their bodies and in their lives with an empowered lens? So anyway, I can really get on a soapbox about that one. But I started working with fertility, and I started to really have a deeper conversation with women about things that were tough to look at, honestly. When we started unpacking what was going on with their menstrual cycle, a whole hell of a lot just came out and up to the surface that was not inspected. And oftentimes it had to do with some really surprising things, like relationships with their mothers and pelvic traumas that they never really processed, and the connection between the body and the memories that they were holding on to or not processing was miraculous. So what I love about vaginal steaming and in the application of fertility is it really opens the door for a conversation, for a woman to have such a conversation inside of herself. Because I really love leading and guiding women in that conversation, but sometimes that's not what she has whatever resources for. But if she sits on a box once a day for 2 months and feels into her pussy and feels what wants to be felt and listens to what wants to be heard and really just blocks that time out to take care of herself, things that need to be sorted out bubble up. And there's just this innate wellness at the bottom of it all. There is an innate fertile nature to everything on this planet. If you look anywhere, everything is trying to express fertility all the time, especially in springtime. If you watch a little pea plant growing up out of the soil, it's just reaching and reaching and tenderling and reaching and blossoming. And that's just what our beautiful human bodies are doing all the time too. And we're not trained to see it that way. So when a woman can sit on this box and re-imprint and sort of erase all of the inappropriate touch that she's ever received, and erase all of the unhelpful narratives she's had about her body and how she looks, and really spend time and nourish and take care and feel good. I have not met a single client that hasn't sorted their fertility issue out by following that practice. And yes, of course, there are lots of different pieces to the puzzle as far as lifestyle and diet and exercise. But what I tend to see with women who are kind of 2 or 3 years down a fertility journey is a hell of a lot of doing and a lot of tension and a lot of feeling wrong. So I find that conversation to be so fulfilling, because it's so easy to point back to the innate wellness and rightness of who she is and who we are and what is really what we are. I think the misidentification of being a infertile body is one of the most painful things women are put through and put themselves through. So getting past the identification of being identified by a body that's broken is so fucking huge, that the body just pew turns into springtime when that bullshit's cracked open. So that's my bit about how this works with fertility. And then, you know, I spend a lot of time studying Ayurveda, and in Ayurveda, they talk about the first 40 days after a woman has birth as this really important time of her life. It's the sacred window, they say, that was when she gathers herself back up. And a lot of how that time is approached, it's sort of like mirrors how we come into menarche and what is going on, and how we are ritualizing or viewing or having others view our first period, how we are working in our fertility journey to empower ourselves, and how we do in that period right after we have a baby. All of those kind of set imprints for how we experience menopause. So a lot of what happens in menopause is similar. It's just a bigger cycle. So there's all these little cycles. There's a monthly cycle happening where each month we have an opportunity to go through the mail, so to speak, in our blood and in our symptoms, to see how we treated ourselves the last month, and what we experienced, and what we took in that we maybe should or shouldn't have, and what we gave that we should or shouldn't have. That happens in menopause in a really big way, in a bigger scale, right? So we're kind of forced to deal with and take stock of these different pieces of our lives, whether we took care of ourselves well or not. So menopause can be really like simplified down into these physical symptoms of night sweats and day sweats and irritability. And I'm actually pretty interested in perimenopause as well. Just like totally forgotten about phase of women's transition that can be really hellish because nobody knows what's going on there. And the cool thing, again, is like it's the same theme here about what is beautiful about vaginal steaming is it helps us find what's right in our bodies, and what is right in our pelvises, and what is right about this shit we're experiencing, and gives us an opportunity to slow down. Our fast-paced lives really aren't doing us justice. We're not getting the time we need to take care. And so sometimes symptoms show up to make sure we do that. And menopause can be a wonderful experience for some women, and it can be hell for some women. And believe it or not, it seems a little counterintuitive to sit over some hot steam. But when you use herbs that are drying or moisturizing and cooling, it really helps with like vaginal dryness and like systemic heat in the body. If you use cooling herbs, the effect is cooling instead of this heat. So some other times of the cycle, or the bigger cycle, when we're vaginal steaming for fertility, for example, we might wear a cloak. We might wear a big robe around us to hold that moisture in and nourish our whole bodies to generate heat and fertility. But in menopause, there's no cloak. You want to keep your neck nice and clear, and then using cooling herbs particularly helps with just about everything. But the thing is, there's the thing that women, I think you might have a different perspective, but what I hear most women are talking about with menopause that are symptoms that they want to get rid of by vaginal steaming are vaginal dryness, low libido, the heat, excess heat, as well as like what this weird rage that comes out of nowhere. So I think I talked about the coolness and the emotional bottling up piece. It's a beautiful thing that happens when we get old and we don't give so many fucks. We just say what we want. And we don't we're not in our 20s like trying to be good girls anymore. We're just like, my grandmother-in-law, she's like in her late 80s and she has no filter whatsoever. She hardly speaks English. She's actually from Norway. No filter whatsoever. And it's beautiful. I'm so happy for her because she's been so clamped up her whole life. She's finally letting it fly. And I think that that's some beautiful rite of passage that a woman in menopause can and should take. And that's probably going to help a lot with any tension that's left over in her pelvis. So that, as well as So, oh yeah, the vaginal dryness and the low libido, that such a fucking shitty story that we tell ourselves that, oh, when we get older, we just don't, women just, it's normal to not have a sex drive, and that's just how it is. Estrogen goes away, and that's just how it is. And it's not, but we think it is, and we just resign to it because we're like, well, I have no idea how to deal with that. So fuck it, I'm not going to try to work at it. And that would be ingenuine. But that's what's beautiful again about this practice, is like sitting over the steam is sensual. And feeling your body, feeling the steam, touch your genitals, touch your labia, penetrate in and like dance around inside of your pelvis. It's very stimulating and very, very pleasurable. And when I say pleasurable, for some women, pleasure is like, it's simply the lack of yucky. And that's enough. That's enough to feel like warm inside and juicy. And when that's coupled with like sensual movement and some pelvic awakening exercises and some other stuff that I do that for women, and that, while my sex drive is low, prescription, can be really beautiful, getting to know like what, maybe we don't even know what turns us on. Maybe we don't even know how we like to be touched because we've just always been like settling for what we're getting. So this beautiful opportunity, maybe when we're finally in menopause, we're willing to give ourselves that opportunity to like take what we actually want, learn our bodies well enough to know what we want by then. But having the blood flow and the circulation, particularly around the issue of vaginal nectar, is just, it's just because it's like when what does the saying go? If you don't use it, you lose it. It really helps us stay connected and continue to use our sensuality and use our sexuality as a point of finding power inside of ourselves, using pleasure as an opportunity to get to know ourselves and to feel powerful and good in our bodies. And then it's just like comes with it's part of the package that vaginal nectar is present and dryness goes away. And it's just part of the package that the libido returns. It's not a problem to like point out and fix, but when we have this greater conversation going on with ourselves and in our pelvises and in our self-care practices and in the way we approach ourselves, then those cultural narratives, which are total bullshit, seem like total bullshit, and we stop believing them. And I guarantee, this guarantee is a strong word. I would bet money, I would bet a lot of money that if you started vaginal steaming regularly, your TMJ would go away. It's actually really, there's 3 diaphragms. There's the soft palate, the breathing diaphragm, and the pelvic floor, and they are mirrors of each other. And when you're working with one, you can really like mindfully bring them all in. So if you've ever experienced pelvic trauma, it's often connected to irritable bowel syndrome and digestive issues and jaw stuff. So this is a really cool way to just like let go of all of the labels of what's wrong and sit on this box and just let the body unwind. It's tough to tell you how long and how often you should steam, even though we've talked a bit about your history, we haven't had a full consult. So when we do a consult, then I understand more about how to prescribe this practice to you. But in general, you can steam anytime you're not bleeding. And when you're pregnant, you don't want to steam. And if you're trying to conceive, like if you're in a fertility journey and you're in the luteal phase, you don't want to steam then, but you can steam before ovulation. So that being said, I steam every day because I'm not trying to get pregnant or anything, and I don't sit long. If I sit too long, it screws up my cycle. even though it feels really good, and sometimes I'm just like, yes, then I get a squirrely cycle or I start spotting. So my body tells me pretty quickly, like, that was too long. I'm going to take this camera and just show you. It might be a little nauseating for a second. Okay, so there's my box. And let's see if I can see what I'm doing here. Inside of there, I have this. So this is for when I put over my lap. These are just sit on top of. Inside, I don't know if you can see, this light's kind of crummy. So I've got this heating element with a cast iron top and then a cast iron pot. And then this guy has a lid. Stuck on there. And then I have the bag of herbs. Can you see the steam? So it's ready to go. I've been waiting. I'll sit down. I thought I would sit down on it while I was talking, but then I forgot. So it's pretty simple, little box. My dad and I built it together. Isn't that hilarious? My dad's like, it's like a real woodsy Michigander guy. So when I told him what I needed, he was like, oh God, okay. Whatever, I've been weirding my dad out since I was 5, so he's used to it. But so it's really not that hard to build, but you can also do like a stock pot and rig up some stools or something so that you can sit. So one thing that people in the media have really like launched a campaign against vaginal steaming for is because you could burn yourself. So you wanna, if you do your own thing, you wanna make sure that the water comes to a boil and then cools down a bit. You can tell by putting your inner wrist over it if it's too hot or not. I'm just giving you these protocols in case you decide to go try to experiment with it, what not to do. For the first time, I caution people not to sit longer than 10 minutes. And then some people only steam for 10 minutes always, depending on what's going on. And to a max of 30 minutes. So it's never that long. It doesn't take long for an intense amount of healing and circulation to happen. I have an affiliate with a woman who builds boxes, and she's got an all-woman run company, and she has really nice boxes that are affordable. So if someone wants a box, then I don't have a box building company right now. So I'm just referring them to her if they want to buy a box of their own. I sell herbs. She sells herbs as well. The internal pieces, I have Amazon links. I think I spent $25 on the burner and maybe 10 or 15 bucks on the pot. So those elements inside are something you can pick up pretty easily, or something you may already have, and you don't even necessarily need them. You could just boil water like on a stove and put the pot in there on a hot pad and just skip that whole part of it too. Well, the cool thing is if you like pay attention while I do that abdominal massage, then you can learn to do it yourself to yourself, and that helps a lot. It's like really, it comes down to attention, blood flow, and like stimulating circulation and like moving the viscera and like just being with You could even go home tonight and rub your belly in whatever way felt good with a little bit of oil, and breathe deep and slow and let things unwind a little bit, and you would probably have some relief. But IBS is a really common thing with, like, I remember when I was telling you about how I was experiencing urge incontinence and having trouble with too much tone in my pelvis. Irritable bowel syndrome is another really common indicator of that same situation. And that's very common for people who have been trespassed in their history, or have injured themselves and fallen on their pelvises and had birth experiences that were really hard, like had to bear down and push for a really long time, that kind of stuff. That's like the equation that you need to know. Like, that's your body giving you a clue that there's some love and attention that's needed. That's it. It's not a lifelong problem.